There is a stage in the decline of empires that historians call the threshold of structural irreversibility. It's not the final collapse. It's something more subtle and more terrifying. It's the point where all the mechanisms that built the empire's wealth and power invert, where the very systems designed to expand prosperity begin extracting from the population instead, where institutions that once served the public good become instruments of elite preservation, and where the political will to reverse course disappears entirely, not because leaders are weak, but because the interests controlling the state no longer benefit from reversal. 17 empires in recorded history reached this stage, not one ever pulled back. The pattern is so consistent across centuries and continents that it stops being coincidence and starts being a map, a 9-stage progression that every dominant civilization has followed from expansion to dissolution. And if you know what to look for, if you understand the sequence, you can identify exactly where a society stands on that map. Let me show you why the United States just crossed into stage 7, the stage that, in historical record as always, without exception led to terminal fragmentation within 1 to 3 decades. The pattern starts with conquest and expansion. Rome in the 3rd century BC, the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century, the Spanish Empire in the 16th, the British in the 19th. In the first stage, empires grow through military dominance or economic capture. They acquire territory, resources, and labor. Wealth flows inward. The core enriches itself from the periphery. Elites accumulate, but the general population also benefits. Roads are built, aqueducts constructed, trade expands. There's enough plunder that even common citizens see rising standards of living. This is the stage where empire feels like progress. In the second stage, the empire reaches its territorial or economic maximum. Rome, at the death of Trajan in 117 AD, controlled everything from Britain to Mesopotamia. The Mongol Empire by 1279 stretched from Korea to Hungary. The British Empire in 1920 governed a quarter of the world's population. At this peak, expansion stops. Not because of conquest failure, but because further growth becomes uneconomical. The cost of administering and defending new territories exceeds the wealth extracted from them. The empire shifts from acquisition to maintenance, and this is where the inversion begins. In the third stage, the cost of maintaining the empire starts to exceed the revenue it generates. Military expenses remain high because borders must be defended. Bureaucracies grow larger because administration becomes more complex. But the easy wealth from initial conquest is gone, so the state begins taxing its core population more heavily. In Rome, this happened in the 3rd century. In the Abbasid Caliphate, by the 9th century. In Spain, by the 17th century. Tax rates rise, state debt increases, and the empire starts borrowing against future revenue. Elites who financed expansion now finance maintenance, but they demand interest. This is the stage where imperial debt becomes structural. Here's where it gets critical. In the 4th stage, elites begin decoupling their wealth from the empire's productivity. They stop investing in infrastructure, industry, or innovation within the empire. Instead, they financialize. They lend to the state at interest. They buy land, rent it back to farmers. They move wealth into assets that extract value rather than create it. In Rome, this was the senatorial class consolidating latifundia estates, worked by slaves, while free farmers were taxed into destitution. In 18th century France, this was the nobility and clergy owning vast lands, tax-exempt, while the Third Estate bore the fiscal burden. In the British Empire, this was the City of London pivoting from industrial investment to global finance as British manufacturing declined. The pattern is identical. Elites become parasitic. They no longer need the empire to produce. They need it to enforce contracts, protect property, and service debt. Their wealth becomes independent of the population's prosperity. In fact, their wealth often grows as the population's declines because they profit from the financial mechanisms, debt, rent, interest, that the struggling state and citizenry must use to survive. The 5th stage is where the middle class begins its collapse. This is the internal hollowing. The productive core of the empire, the merchants, the artisans, the small landholders, the people who generate tax revenue and economic activity, they start to disappear. Squeezed between rising taxes from the state and rising rents and interest payments to elites, they lose their property, their businesses, their status. In Rome, the class of small freeholder farmers that built the Republic was effectively extinct by 200 AD. In pre-revolutionary France, the bourgeoisie was debt-trapped and resentful by 1780. In the Soviet Union, the technical and professional class was decimated by the 1980s through stagnation and extraction. When the middle class collapses, two things happen. Tax revenue falls because the productive base shrinks, and social mobility disappears because the ladder between poverty and wealth is removed. Societies stratify into a small elite and a large dispossessed population. The empire becomes a wealth extraction machine rather than a wealth generation engine. And this is the stage where fiscal crisis becomes permanent. The state can't tax enough to cover expenses because the middle class that used to pay is gone, so it borrows more. Debt spirals, and the only people who can lend to the state are the elites, who demand policy concessions in exchange. Stage 6 is elite fragmentation. The ruling class fractures into factions competing for control of the declining state. In Rome, this was the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD, when over 50 emperors were proclaimed in 49 years, mostly by competing military factions. In the Abbasid Caliphate, this was the rise of autonomous governors and warlords who ruled provinces nominally under the caliph but retained revenue. In the Soviet Union, this was the split between hardliners and reformers in the 1980s. Each faction represents a segment of the elite with different assets and different strategies for preservation. Military elites want state spending and defense. Financial elites want austerity and debt service. Regional elites want autonomy. Productive elites, if any remain, want reform. But here's the key. None of these factions want to dismantle the extraction system. They just want to control it. So the state becomes a contested prize. Policy becomes incoherent. Institutions are weaponized by whichever faction temporarily controls them. And the population, the common citizens, they lose faith in the system entirely. They stop believing that the state represents them or that participation matters. Civic cohesion disintegrates. And that brings us to stage 7, the point of structural irreversibility. This is the stage the United States entered in the last decade, and it's the stage from which no empire in history has ever recovered. Here's what defines it. The state loses the capacity to reform itself. Not because reform is impossible theoretically, but because every possible reform threatens a vital elite faction. Reducing military spending threatens defense contractors and the security apparatus. Reducing entitlement spending threatens retirees and the financial institutions holding government debt. Raising taxes on the wealthy threatens capital, which responds by moving wealth offshore or lobbying for carve-outs. Cutting bureaucracy threatens the administrative class. Every direction is blocked. In the Roman Empire, this was the 4th century. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine restructured the state, but they couldn't reform the latifundia system or the tax exemptions for the senatorial class because those were the elites keeping them in power. So they increased taxes on everyone else, debased the currency, and enforced serfdom to keep the system functioning. In the Ottoman Empire, this was the 18th century, when sultans knew the Janissary Corps and the provincial governors were bleeding the state dry, but couldn't disband them without triggering civil war. In the Soviet Union, this was Gorbachev's position in 1985. He knew the command economy was failing, but reform threatened the Communist Party, the military, and the KGB. Every move destabilized a pillar. This is the trap. The state still functions. Taxes are collected. Debt is serviced. Laws are enforced. But the system is frozen. It cannot adapt. It cannot address the fiscal crisis, the legitimacy crisis, or the economic decline, because every adaptation threatens the coalition holding it together. And so the state continues on autopilot, performing the motions of governance while the underlying structure rots. Here's how you know a society has reached stage 7. Policy stops correlating with public preference. In the Roman Empire, emperors kept debasing currency despite knowing it caused inflation, because the alternative was military mutiny. In pre-revolutionary France, the monarchy knew the tax system was destroying the economy, but couldn't reform it because the nobility would revolt. In the Soviet Union, the Politburo knew central planning had failed, but couldn't liberalize because the party apparatus would disintegrate. The state becomes responsive only to elite factions. The population's needs are rhetorically acknowledged but structurally ignored. Another marker is that crises stop producing reform. In a healthy state, a financial crisis, a military defeat, or a social uprising triggers adaptation. The system corrects. But in stage 7, crises produce only short-term patches that protect elite interests. The 2008 financial crisis in the United States should have led to structural reform of the financial system. Instead, it led to bank bailouts and expanded financialization. The COVID pandemic should have led to healthcare and supply chain restructuring. Instead, it led to unprecedented money printing that inflated asset prices, enriching the wealthy while real wages stagnated. The pattern is consistent and postpones systemic adjustment. Let me show you the specific mechanisms that indicate the United States has entered this stage. Start with the debt. In 2000, US federal debt was $5.6 trillion, 55% of GDP. Today it's $36 trillion, approaching 130% of GDP. This isn't a failure, it's a feature. The debt is held mostly by financial institutions, pension funds, foreign governments, and the Federal Reserve. These entities profit from the interest, roughly $1.2 trillion per year as of 2024. Any attempt to reduce the debt through austerity would collapse asset values, tank the stock market, and trigger a deflationary crisis that would destroy the wealth of the creditor class. So the debt must grow. The system requires it. And this means the government's fiscal capacity is permanently constrained. A third of the budget goes to interest payments, another third to entitlements that can't be cut without political suicide, another third to defense and operations. There's no slack, no room for new priorities. Now look at wealth concentration. In 1980, the top 1% of Americans held 22% of the nation's wealth. Today it's over 35%. The top 0.1% hold 20%. This isn't an accident of policy. It's the result of deliberate structural choices. Tax cuts in 1981, 2001, 2017, financial deregulation in 1999, quantitative easing in 2008 and 2020. Each of these policies was justified as growth promotion, but the growth went almost entirely to asset holders. Real wages for the median worker have been flat since 1973. Adjusted for inflation, the typical American worker earns less per hour today than 50 years ago. Meanwhile, asset value stocks, real estate, bonds have exploded. Wealth isn't being created, it's being transferred upward through financial mechanisms. Debt, rent, interest. The same tools the Roman senatorial class used. The same tools the French nobility used. Now look at institutional trust. In 1964, 77% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. Today it's 16%. Trust in Congress is 7%. Trust in media, 11%. Trust in corporations, 18%. This isn't partisan. Both left and right have collapsed faith in institutions, because regardless of which party holds power, policy outcomes remain the same. Wars continue, debt grows, wealth concentrates, wages stagnate. The population has learned, correctly, that their input doesn't matter. Voting changes personnel but not direction. This is the hallmark of stage 7. The population disengages because the system is non-responsive. Now look at elite fragmentation. The United States has multiple competing factions within the ruling class. The defense and intelligence apparatus wants perpetual military engagement and surveillance expansion. The financial sector wants low interest rates, bailouts, and deregulation. The tech sector wants monopoly protection and government contracts. The industrial remnant wants tariffs and reshoring. The political class wants power retention and donor satisfaction. These factions are incompatible. They want opposite policies, and so the state lurches between them, unable to commit to any coherent strategy. Defense spending increases even as infrastructure crumbles. Financial markets are propped up even as productivity declines. Tech monopolies are rhetorically attacked but structurally protected. Trade policy swings wildly. It's gridlock between factions, each strong enough to block the others, but none strong enough to impose a unified vision. Here's the mechanism that locks it in. The United States electoral system is funded by the same elites who benefit from the extraction system. In 2020, total campaign spending exceeded $14 billion. That money came overwhelmingly from corporations, financial institutions, and wealthy individuals. Not because they care about democracy, because they're buying policy access. Both parties are dependent on this funding, which means both parties are structurally constrained from enacting policies that threaten donor interests. You cannot run a competitive national campaign without elite financial backing, and you cannot get elite financial backing if your platform threatens elite wealth. This is the trap. Reform requires political power. Political power requires funding. Funding requires elite approval. Elites don't approve reform. The loop is closed. The comparison to Rome is precise. By the 4th century, becoming emperor required the support of either the military or the senatorial class. Both demanded policies that extracted from the population. Emperors who attempted reform, like Julian, who tried to restore free farming and reduce corruption, were either assassinated or undone by their own coalitions. The system was frozen. The United States is in the same structural position. Any politician who threatens the debt system, the military budget, or financial sector dominance will be defunded, primaried, or marginalized. The system defends itself. Stage 8 is what comes next, and this is where history becomes a precise guide. In every empire that reached stage 7, the next phase is territorial or political fragmentation. The state loses the capacity to enforce uniform control. Regions, classes, or factions begin operating independently. In Rome, this was the division into East and West in 285 AD, followed by the collapse of central authority in the West by 476. In the Abbasid Caliphate, this was the breakaway of Egypt, Persia, and North Africa into independent dynasties by the 10th century. In the Soviet Union, this was the independence of the republics in 1991. In the Spanish Empire, this was the loss of the Americas in the early 19th century. Fragmentation doesn't mean the state disappears immediately. It means the state becomes hollow. It claims authority but cannot project power. It issues laws but cannot enforce them uniformly. Regions begin ignoring federal mandates. Cities implement contradictory policies. Populations sort themselves geographically by ideology or identity. Trade and currency systems fracture. In the United States, you're already seeing early signals. States nullifying federal drug law, sanctuary cities ignoring immigration enforcement, regional economic blocs forming, urban-rural polarization deepening. These are not anomalies, they're the leading indicators of territorial fragmentation. The state still exists, the flag still flies, but the coherence is dissolving. Stage 9 is collapse, and collapse doesn't mean apocalypse. It means the empire ceases to function as a unified entity. The Roman Empire collapsed, but people still lived in Rome. They just weren't Roman citizens of a functioning imperial state anymore. They were subjects of warlords, Ostrogothic kings, or the Byzantine remnant. The Abbasid Caliphate collapsed, but Baghdad still existed. The Soviet Union collapsed, but Russians still lived in Moscow. They just weren't citizens of a superpower anymore. Collapse is a transition from imperial structure to post-imperial fragments, and for the population, it's catastrophic. Because all the systems that depend on imperial cohesion, currency stability, property rights, supply chains, contract enforcement, legal uniformity, they break down. Savings evaporate, pensions default, trade disrupts, violence increases. Not because people become irrational, because the institutions that managed cooperation disintegrate. Here's what the historical pattern tells us about timing. From stage 7 to fragmentation is typically 10 to 30 years. Rome entered stage 7 around 235 AD and fragmented by 285. The Abbasid Caliphate entered stage 7 in the 9th century and fragmented by 950. The Soviet Union entered stage 7 in the late 1970s and collapsed in 1991. The Spanish Empire entered stage 7 in the late 18th century and lost its territorial cohesion by 1825. The range is wide because the speed depends on external shocks, wars, pandemics, natural disasters, financial crises. But the direction is uniform. Once stage 7 is reached, no empire has ever restored itself to growth and cohesion. Now let me address the obvious question. Can the United States avoid this? Theoretically, yes. If the debt burden were restructured, if wealth concentration were reversed, if elite factions unified around a reform agenda, if political institutions regained public trust, if fiscal policy prioritized productive investment over financialization. But here's the problem. Every one of those changes requires short-term pain for elites. Debt restructuring means creditors take losses. Wealth redistribution means the top 1% lose assets. Political reform means donors lose influence. Fiscal rebalancing means financiers lose returns. And elites, as a class, will not voluntarily accept losses. They will use every tool they control, media, lobbying, campaign funding, regulatory capture, to block reform. This is the core insight. The point of no return isn't economic, it's political. The United States has the resources, the technology, the population to rebuild a productive economy. But it lacks the political capacity to redirect those resources because the people who control resource allocation benefit from the current system, and they're not going to let it change. History shows two paths from stage 7: managed fragmentation or chaotic collapse. Managed fragmentation is what happened to the British Empire. Recognizing it couldn't hold the colonies, Britain negotiated independence, retained financial and cultural ties, and transitioned from territorial empire to financial hub. London is still a power centre, not because Britain rules the world, but because it controls capital flows. This is the best case scenario for the dissolution, where the federal structure weakens, regions gain autonomy, but financial and military elites retain global influence through capital markets and alliances. Chaotic collapse is what happened to the Soviet Union. The state disintegrated rapidly, currency collapsed, savings were destroyed, oligarchs looted state assets, life expectancy dropped, regional conflicts erupted. It took 15 years for Russia to restabilize under a new authoritarian structure. This is the worst case, where institutions fail, supply chains break, and the population suffers mass impoverishment. Which path the United States takes depends on whether elites can coordinate a managed decline, or whether they fragment into open conflict. Right now, the signs point toward fragmentation. The defense establishment, the financial sector, the tech monopolies, the political factions, they're not cooperating. They're competing, and competition between elite factions in stage 7 always accelerates collapse. Here's what this means for you. The empire isn't going to announce its decline. There won't be a press conference where leaders admit the system is broken. Instead, you'll see a continued degradation. Currency devaluation through inflation, asset bubbles followed by crashes, regional policy divergence, increased internal migration as people flee declining areas, social trust continuing to erode, institutions becoming more openly corrupt, political theatre intensifying while actual governance deteriorates. This won't happen next year, it's a process. But the process is underway, and if you understand the 9-stage map, you can see it. Your task isn't to fix the empire. You can't. The forces at play are structural, not individual. Your task is to recognize the pattern. Understand that what feels like chaos is actually a historical progression. Realize that the people in charge aren't going to save you because they're not in charge of the system. They're trapped in it just like everyone else. Maybe more so because their wealth and status depend on perpetuating the extraction, even as it undermines the foundation. The empire doesn't collapse because leaders are evil or stupid. It collapses because the system itself, built over centuries, reaches a stage where it can no longer adapt, and we're in that stage now. You're watching history repeat, not because humanity is doomed to cycles, but because empires, all empires, are built on the same mechanics: expansion, extraction, financialization, elite capture, and eventually disintegration. The United States is not exceptional. It's following the map, and once you see the map, you can't unsee it. Every policy decision, every crisis response, every elite maneuver, it all fits the pattern. Stage 7, structural irreversibility, the point where no empire has ever turned back. If you want to keep tracking this, if you want to understand each phase as it unfolds, subscribe, because the next decade is going to be the most historically significant period of your life. Not because something might happen, because it's already happening. The collapse map isn't a prediction, it's a description. And the United States just crossed the line that every other empire crossed before it fell.